The mid-18th century was a time of shifting power, ambition, and unrest. The British Empire stood as the most powerful force in the world. Its red, coated soldiers marched across continents, its navy ruled the seas, and its colonies stretched far beyond Europe. Among its prized possessions were the 13 colonies on the eastern coast of North America. At first glance, these settlements seemed loyal and grateful, but beneath the surface, a storm was beginning to form. For decades, the colonists had lived with a sense of independence. They built towns, farms, and trade networks. They managed their own assemblies and created their own local rules. Britain was far away, and though it claimed authority, its hand often felt light. Colonists grew used to freedom, and with each passing year, they saw themselves less as subjects of a king and more as people with a right to decide their own destiny. The spark of revolution, however, came from war. Between 1756 and 1763, Britain fought the 7 Years' War against France, a conflict that spilled into North America, where it was called the French and Indian War. Britain emerged victorious, seizing vast territories, but victory came with a staggering cost. The war had drained the treasury. The empire now looked to its colonies as a source of revenue, demanding that they shoulder part of the burden. To British leaders, this seemed reasonable. To the colonists, it felt like betrayal. They had already sacrificed lives and resources in the war, yet instead of gratitude, they received new laws and new taxes. The Stamp Act of 1765, requiring colonists to pay for official paper, was just the beginning. Soon came the Townshend Acts and the Tea Act, each designed to pull money from the colonies without their consent. What angered the colonists most was not the amount of tax, but the principle. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. They had no voice in the decisions that affected them. They were, in essence, being treated like subjects without rights. Out of this frustration rose a rallying cry that echoed from New England to the Carolinas. No taxation without representation. It was not yet a call for independence, but it was the seed of rebellion. Every law Britain passed, every attempt to tighten its grip, pushed the colonies further away. A new identity was forming among the settlers, an American identity. And once that identity began to grow, there was no turning back. The revolution was waiting to be born. When the smoke of the 7 Years' War cleared, the British Empire stood taller than ever before. But its victory came with a heavy price. War had drained the treasury. Britain had borrowed massive sums of money and now faced a mountain of debt. To pay it back, Parliament turned its gaze to the colonies, reasoning that since the war had been fought partly to defend them, it was only fair they should contribute. At first, the measures seemed practical to London, but in America, they felt like chains tightening around free men's throats. In 1765, the Stamp Act was introduced, requiring colonists to purchase official stamps on every legal document, newspaper, and even playing cards. For colonists who prided themselves on independence, it was more than a tax, it was an insult. Crowds took to the streets in protest. Effigies of tax collectors were hung and burned. Under pressure, Britain repealed the law, but the damage had been done. The colonists had tasted resistance and found its flavor intoxicating. The relief was short-lived. Soon came the Townshend Acts of 1767, placing duties on imported glass, lead, paint, and tea. To enforce these taxes, British officials had the power to search homes and businesses without warning. This intrusion into private lives struck at the heart of colonial freedom. Merchants began boycotting British goods, and ordinary citizens refused to purchase taxed items. A sense of unity was forming, not out of love for one another, but out of shared anger against a distant power. The British government, however, misread the mood. They believed firmness would restore obedience. More troops were sent across the Atlantic, marching through colonial streets in gleaming red coats, muskets on their shoulders. Instead of awe, their presence bred resentment. Colonists saw them not as protectors but as occupiers. Tension simmered, waiting for the smallest spark to explode. Then, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, giving the struggling British East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced price. At first glance, it seemed like a gift, cheaper tea. But for colonists, it was another trick. They were being forced to buy from one company, their choices stripped away. The message was clear: Britain would decide what they drank, bought, and paid for. In taverns and town halls, angry voices rose. Words like liberty, rights, and tyranny echoed louder than ever before. Colonists who once thought of themselves as loyal subjects of the king began to imagine a different future. Seeds had been planted, seeds of rebellion that no act of parliament could root out. The soil of America was rich with discontent, and soon it would bloom into revolution. If the revolution had a heartbeat, it pulsed in Boston. No city in the colonies bristled with more defiance. No streets echoed louder with the cries of liberty. By the 1770s, Boston was not just a town of merchants and fishermen. It was a tinderbox, and every new British law struck flint against stone. British troops had been stationed there to keep order, but their presence was a daily reminder of oppression. Red, coated soldiers drilled in the commons, guarded warehouses, and swaggered through taverns. They were paid poorly, and many sought work on the side, competing with local laborers for jobs. Resentment grew, not only against British authority, but against the soldiers themselves. Quarrels in alleys, insults hurled in markets. Boston was boiling. On the evening of March 5, 1770, that tension erupted. A crowd gathered near the custom house, jeering at a small group of British soldiers. Snowballs turned to stones. Shouts turned to threats. In the chaos, a soldier fired his musket. Then more shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent who would be remembered as one of the first martyrs of liberty. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Patriot leaders like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere wasted no time. Revere engraved a dramatic print of the shooting, showing defenseless colonists mowed down by ruthless soldiers. It was propaganda, yes, but effective propaganda. Across the colonies, the Boston Massacre was retold as proof that Britain was a tyrant willing to shed innocent blood. Tensions might have cooled, but Britain only tightened its grip. When Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, Boston became the stage for another act of defiance. On the night of December 16, 1773, men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships docked in the harbor. With crowds cheering from the wharf, they split open more than 340 chests of tea and dumped them into the icy waters. The harbor turned black with the leaves of rebellion. This was no random act of vandalism. It was a bold statement that the colonies would not bow to unjust laws. Britain's fury was swift. To punish Massachusetts, Parliament unleashed the coercive acts, or as the colonists called them, the intolerable acts. The port of Boston was closed. The Massachusetts government was stripped of its power. British soldiers could now lodge in private homes. It was meant to break the spirit of rebellion. Instead, it spread it. Boston's sparks had set fire to all 13 colonies. What began as scattered protests was fast becoming a unified cry for freedom. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, Parliament's patience snapped. To them, this was not just rebellion. It was an insult to the Crown itself. In 1774, the British government unleashed a series of harsh laws known officially as the Coercive Acts, but to the colonists, they would forever be remembered as the Intolerable Acts. The first strike came against Boston. Its harbor, once bustling with trade, was closed until the ruined tea was paid for. Ships lay idle, wharves fell silent, and thousands of workers found themselves without livelihood. The punishment did not stop there. Massachusetts' charter was revoked, stripping the colony of its right to self-government. Town meetings, where citizens once gathered to debate and decide local matters, were now tightly restricted. To many colonists, it felt as if Britain had declared war on liberty itself. Adding fuel to the fire, the acts allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, far from colonial juries. Soldiers could now be quartered in private homes, forcing families to house the very men they despised. And while colonists reeled from these blows, Parliament added another with the Quebec Act, extending Canada's borders south into lands claimed by American settlers. It seemed to the colonists that their future was being choked off piece by piece. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, however, the intolerable acts united the colonies. Outrage swept through Virginia, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, and beyond. Colonists who had once hesitated to oppose Britain now recognized that if Boston could be punished, no colony was safe. Solidarity became the cry. Food and supplies poured into Massachusetts from neighbors near and far, a gesture of brotherhood that showed Britain's plan had backfired. In September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies, all but Georgia, gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. For many, it was the first time meeting men from distant regions, yet in that hall, they spoke with one voice. They declared the intolerable acts null and void, urged colonies to form militias, and agreed to a boycott of British goods. While they stopped short of declaring independence, the Congress was a bold step toward unity. Still, beneath the cautious words, a dangerous truth simmered. The colonies were no longer pleading for rights within the empire. They were preparing to stand against it. Britain had meant to crush rebellion by punishing Boston. Instead, it had awakened a continent. The stage was set, and the first shots of war were only months away. By early 1775, the tension between Britain and her colonies was stretched to its breaking point. The intolerable acts had convinced Americans that resistance was no longer optional. It was survival. Local militias made up of farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers began drilling regularly. They called themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a moment's notice. Across New England, whispers spread of hidden gunpowder, muskets, and supplies tucked away in barns and cellars. The British knew rebellion was taking root, and they resolved to stamp it out before it grew beyond control. General Thomas Gage, the commander of British forces in Boston, received orders to march on Concord, Massachusetts, where the colonists had hidden weapons. On the night of April 18, 1775, hundreds of redcoats slipped out of the city, their boots pounding the road in silence. But the patriots were watching. That same night, riders fanned out through the countryside. Among them was Paul Revere, who galloped from town to town, warning, "The British are coming!" His lantern signal from the Old North Church lit the dark sky, one if by land, two if by sea. At dawn, the British reached the small town of Lexington. On the village green, about 70 Minutemen stood nervously, facing nearly 700 trained soldiers. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then, a single shot rang out. No one knows who fired it, but it shattered the peace of the colonies. Muskets flared. Smoke filled the air, and when it cleared, 8 colonists lay dead. The war for independence had begun with what would forever be called the shot heard round the world. The redcoats pressed on to Concord, where they searched for weapons. But at the North Bridge, they met stiff resistance. Militiamen poured musket fire into the ranks of the British, forcing them into retreat. As the soldiers marched back toward Boston, thousands of colonists swarmed from fields and woods, firing from behind fences and trees. The disciplined British army suddenly found itself harried by a countryside in open revolt. By the time the redcoats staggered back into Boston, they had suffered heavy losses, nearly 300 killed or wounded. The colonists, though inexperienced, had shown they could stand against the most powerful army in the world. The myth of British invincibility was broken. What happened at Lexington and Concord was more than a skirmish. It was the point of no return. With the crack of musket fire, 13 colonies were transformed. No longer subjects begging for rights, they were rebels fighting for freedom. The revolution had truly begun. The battles of Lexington and Concord had turned the colonies from restless subjects into open rebels. Yet enthusiasm alone would not win a war. What the colonists lacked was organization, leadership, and an army that could stand toe to toe with Britain's professional soldiers. In May 1775, as militias swarmed around Boston, the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. There, delegates debated the future. Should they seek reconciliation with Britain or prepare for full-scale war? The answer came in the form of a tall Virginian with calm eyes and a commanding presence, George Washington, chosen unanimously as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Washington symbolized unity. A Southerner leading largely New England forces showed that this was not merely Boston's fight. It was all of America's fight. When Washington arrived outside Boston, he found thousands of militiamen full of spirit, but short on discipline. Some carried hunting rifles, others farm tools. Supplies were scarce, and training was almost non-existent. Yet Washington's quiet determination inspired them. He wore no crown, claimed no throne, but carried himself with the authority of a man destined to lead. The first major clash under this new reality came at Bunker Hill in June 1775. Colonial forces fortified the high ground overlooking Boston, and when British troops stormed the hill, the colonists fought fiercely. Twice the redcoats were driven back by devastating musket fire. Only when the Americans ran out of powder did the British finally take the position. Technically, it was a British victory, but at terrible cost, over 1,000 casualties. The colonists had stood firm against the might of the empire, proving that courage and determination could balance numbers and training. Despite the bloodshed, Congress still sent the olive branch petition to King George VII, begging for peace. The answer was swift and merciless. The king declared the colonies in open rebellion and promised to crush them with force. To Americans, it was clear there would be no reconciliation, only war. Meanwhile, Washington set about transforming the ragtag militias into a real army. He drilled his men, demanded discipline, and instilled pride. Supplies remained scarce. Many soldiers marched barefoot, their clothes ragged, but Washington's steady leadership held them together. Each small victory, each act of defiance, became proof that freedom was worth the sacrifice. The revolution had entered a new stage. It was no longer a series of scattered uprisings. It was now a war commanded by a leader who understood both the cost and the promise of liberty. Under George Washington, the Continental Army became more than soldiers. It became the embodiment of a nation struggling to be born. By 1776, the colonies stood at a crossroads. The battles of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had proven their willingness to fight, but many still clung to the hope that peace with Britain might be possible. For centuries, they had been proud subjects of the crown. To sever that bond was unthinkable. Yet every month of bloodshed, every new order from King George hardened hearts. Slowly, the idea of independence shifted from a radical whisper to a roaring demand. One of the most powerful voices fueling this change was Thomas Paine, an English-born writer who had recently arrived in America. In January 1776, he published a fiery pamphlet titled Common Sense. With simple, direct language, Paine attacked the monarchy itself, calling kings nothing better than the principal ruffian of some restless gang. He argued that America's destiny was not to be chained to a distant island, but to stand free and govern itself. "'Tis time to part," he declared. The word spread like wildfire, stirring taverns, churches, and town squares. Suddenly, independence no longer seemed reckless. It seemed inevitable. In June, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. At its heart was Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian with a gift for words. Jefferson shut himself away in a small room, quill scratching late into the night. What he produced was more than a political statement. It was a vision of a new world. He began with immortal lines. "We'll hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." These words were a thunderclap, declaring that liberty was not granted by kings but born into every human being. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4, the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted. Bells rang across Philadelphia. Crowds gathered in celebration. In New York, when the Declaration was read aloud, patriots tore down a statue of King George III, melting its lead to make musket balls. For the first time, Americans no longer fought as British subjects seeking rights. They fought as a new nation claiming its freedom. Yet the moment was also perilous. The men who signed the Declaration knew they were committing treason. If the revolution failed, they would hang. But they signed anyway, pledging their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. Their courage lit a flame that would guide generations. The United States of America had been declared. Now it had to be defended. Declaring independence was bold, but surviving it was another matter. By late 1776, the young United States was hanging by a thread. Britain had sent thousands of soldiers and ships to crush the rebellion, and the Continental Army was no match for their size and power. George Washington, though steady and determined, faced defeat after defeat. The first great blow came at New York. In the summer of 1776, British General William Howe landed with over 30 Zalozant troops, the largest force Britain had ever sent overseas. Washington's inexperienced army tried to hold Brooklyn Heights, but was badly beaten. Only a daring nighttime escape across the East River saved the Continental Army from destruction. In the months that followed, Washington's forces were chased across New Jersey, ragged and retreating. Morale sank. Soldiers deserted, food and ammunition ran short, and many wondered if independence had been a doomed dream. But Washington refused to give in. On Christmas night, 1776, with snow falling and the Delaware River choked with ice, he led a daring counterattack. Crossing in small boats, his army surprised a Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The victory electrified the colonies. 2 weeks later, he struck again at Princeton, proving that the American cause was not dead. These victories didn't win the war, but they breathed life back into a struggling army and a wavering people. The following years were harsh. Nowhere was that suffering clearer than at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777-1778. Washington's army camped in bitter cold, lacking shoes, coats, and food. Men left bloody footprints in the snow. Disease swept through the camp, killing hundreds. Desperation weighed heavily, yet in that bleak season, the army found new strength. The arrival of Baron von Steuben, a former Prussian officer, transformed the ragged volunteers into disciplined soldiers. Drilling daily, they learned to march, maneuver, and fight as a unified force. By spring, the army that staggered into Valley Forge emerged tougher, sharper, and ready for battle. Hope also came from beyond the colonies. News of American resilience and the stunning victory at Saratoga convinced France to formally join the war. French supplies, money, and troops would soon flow into the struggle, turning the tide. But for ordinary soldiers, hope was more personal. It was the promise of freedom for their families, the belief that their sacrifice would mean something greater than themselves. Hardship tested the revolution, but it also hardened it. From defeat and suffering, the Americans found resolve. They had declared independence with words. Now, through pain and perseverance, they were learning what it meant to fight for it. By 1781, the guns had grown quieter. The American victory at Yorktown had effectively sealed the fate of British hopes. But winning battles was only part of the struggle. The colonies still had to secure international recognition and negotiate peace with one of the most powerful empires in the world. This was where diplomacy became just as crucial as the fighting that had raged for years across the continent. Negotiations began in Paris in 1782. With American representatives Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay leading the effort. These men carried not only the burden of securing independence, but also the responsibility of ensuring the survival of a fragile new nation. Franklin's charm and reputation in France gave him an advantage at the court of Versailles, while Adams brought a stern determination to demand recognition of American sovereignty. Jay, cautious and strategic, pushed a deal directly with Britain, rather than letting France dictate the terms. The talks were long and difficult. Britain was reluctant to acknowledge the complete independence of its colonies. For years, it had considered the revolution nothing more than a rebellion that could be suppressed. But Yorktown had shattered that illusion, and Britain's treasury, drained from years of global conflict, could no longer sustain the war. As negotiations continued, the Americans pushed for generous boundaries, demanding territory that stretched to the Mississippi River and access to valuable fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. In November 1782, preliminary articles of peace were signed, and by September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was officially ratified. In this treaty, Britain finally recognized the independence of the United States of America. The new nation was granted vast lands, doubling its size and laying the groundwork for future expansion. The treaty also secured crucial trade rights, giving the United States an opportunity to grow its economy independently. For the American people, the moment was transformative. After 8 long years of war, loss, and sacrifice, the dream of independence was no longer just words written on parchment, it was reality. Soldiers returned home, weary but proud, while towns and cities erupted in celebration. Yet beneath the joy lay the enormous challenge of building a government from scratch. Independence had been won, but now the work of creating unity among 13 diverse states began. The Treaty of Paris marked not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new chapter in world history. For the first time, a colony had broken free from an empire and established itself as a republic, sending a powerful message that freedom and self-determination were ideals worth fighting for. By 1778, the Revolutionary War had reached a critical stage. The early battles had proved that the Americans were capable of fighting. But the British still controlled major cities like New York and Philadelphia. The winter at Valley Forge had nearly broken Washington's army. Yet it also revealed something extraordinary, the resilience of a people determined to win their freedom. Washington's leadership, along with the training introduced by Baron von Steuben, turned the ragtag soldiers into a disciplined fighting force. They were no longer simply farmers with muskets. They were becoming a professional army. Meanwhile, a significant event across the Atlantic was about to change everything: the entry of France into the war. Since the beginning of the Revolution, the Continental Congress had secretly sought allies. Benjamin Franklin, with his charm, wit, and brilliance, had been in Paris for years, persuading the French court to support the American cause. France had hesitated, waiting to see if the rebellion could actually stand against Britain's might. But after the stunning American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, France was convinced that the Americans had a real chance. In 1778, France officially declared war on Britain and formed an alliance with the United States. This was a turning point. Suddenly, the Americans were no longer fighting alone. French money, supplies, and troops began to flow across the Atlantic. Even more powerful was the French Navy, which threatened Britain's dominance at sea. Spain and the Dutch Republic would later join the fight against Britain, further stretching its empire thin across the globe. For the Americans, morale soared. Soldiers who once doubted whether independence was possible now felt the strength of powerful allies behind them. Washington himself was rejuvenated. He knew that the war was far from over, but for the first time, he could see a path to victory. Britain faced a new reality. It was no longer just putting down a rebellion, it was fighting a world war. Still, the struggle continued to be brutal. Skirmishes raged in the South, where loyalist militias clashed with patriot fighters. Native American tribes were pulled into the conflict, some siding with the British in hopes of stopping colonial expansion, others aligning with the Americans. The war became not just a battle between armies, but a civil conflict that tore families and communities apart. Yet, despite the hardships, one truth was clear: the revolution had entered a new phase. With French support and the resilience of its people, America's dream of independence was closer than ever. The tide had begun to turn, and the world was watching. The Revolutionary War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, but winning independence was only the beginning of America's journey. 13 colonies had fought side by side against Britain, yet once the war ended, they faced a daunting question. How would these newly freed states govern themselves? Victory had come at a heavy cost. Cities destroyed, farms ruined, soldiers unpaid, and debts piling high. The dream of liberty now had to be translated into reality, and the young nation struggled to stand on its own feet. At first, the new United States operated under the Articles of Confederation. This loose framework gave most power to the states and left the national government weak, unable to raise taxes or even enforce its own laws. Each state printed its own money, set its own trade rules, and often quarreled with neighbors. Farmers who had fought in the Revolution returned home to find themselves burdened with debts and heavy taxes. In Massachusetts, frustration erupted into Shays' Rebellion in 1786, where farmers rose up against the government, demanding relief. These struggles made it clear that independence alone was not enough. Without unity, the Revolution's sacrifices could be wasted. Recognizing the danger, leaders from across the states gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 for what would become the Constitutional Convention. Men like George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton debated for months. Their task was monumental: to design a government strong enough to hold the country together, yet still protect the freedoms the Revolution had fought for. From these debates emerged the United States Constitution, a bold new framework balancing power between the federal government and the states, and creating a system of checks and balances. For the first time, a nation attempted to be built not around a king or empire, but around principles of democracy and individual rights. When George Washington was elected the first president in 1789, he symbolized the ideals of the Revolution. He refused the temptation of power for life, and instead set the precedent of peaceful leadership. Though the road ahead was uncertain, the Revolution had done more than defeat the world's most powerful empire. It had inspired the belief that ordinary people could govern themselves, that liberty was worth fighting for, and that a nation founded on ideals could endure. The birth of America marked not just the end of colonial rule, but the beginning of a grand experiment, one that would shape the world for centuries to come.